Cryptography. For most people, it's this world of pure math, right? Elegant algorithms, huge prime numbers, stuff that seems totally uncrackable.
Mm-hmm. Theoretically uncrackable.
Exactly. But we know the real story, don't we? That mathematical perfection, well, it rarely survives contact with actual messy human code.
That's precisely where we're diving in today.
Okay.
We're looking at the Achilles heel of security, and it's almost always the implementation. The math could be, absolutely flawless.
Right.
But the second a developer writes some code, or maybe they just stick with a default setting, or they don't think about the physical environment, well, that perfection just gets shattered by bugs, memory leaks, even physical attacks.
So our mission today is really to dissect these implementation nightmares,
Mm.
the common coding mistakes, the design flaws that creep in, and maybe most interestingly, those sneaky physical side channel attacks that can break systems that look totally solid on paper.
Yep. We've pulled together a whole range of sources for this. We're talking fundamental crypto texts, think Schneier, but also low-level hacking guides, security engineering best practices, even some historical spy stories.
So we're definitely moving past the textbook math. We're grounding this in the reality of low-level engineering for you.
Yeah.
Okay, so where do things first start to go wrong? You mentioned this distinction between the algorithm and the whole system.
Yeah, that's fundamental. To see where the failures happen, you've got to separate the cryptographic algorithm,
Yeah.
the mathematical recipe, from the complete crypto system.
Right.
A lot of developers, they focus just on the algorithm. They pick AES or RSA. Think great, strong crypto and assume that strength just magically translates to a secure product.
Okay, so if the algorithm is like the engine, what's the rest of the car? What makes up the whole crypto system?
Well, the system includes the algorithm, sure, but also all the possible inputs, plain text, all the possible outputs, ciphertext, and crucially, the keys. How are they generated? How are they stored? How are they used? The whole protocol matters. And especially when we talk about symmetric algorithms, conventional crypto, where the same key encrypts and decrypts the entire security promise hangs on keeping that one secret key totally secret.
So the math proves, okay, if the key is secret, the ciphertext is secure. But the actual code, that has to do hundreds of things, right?
Yeah.
Allocate memory, maybe shuffle bits around, manage timing, all just to make sure the key stays secret while it's being used.
Exactly.
And that gap between secret in theory and secret in operation, that seems like the first place things break down.
It's a huge gap, a massive operational leap, and it immediately creates these subtle weaknesses, even with well-known, well-studied algorithms like RSA. People using what we sometimes call textbook RSA, just the raw math, they run into trouble really fast.
Textbook RSA, I've heard that term. The basic math is okay, but implementing it just like the textbook says is dangerous. Why is that?
It comes down to predictable inputs. So textbook RSA, basically, you take the message M, raise it to a public exponent, E modulo N. Simple enough. But what if your message M is really small and predictable? Like maybe it's just the number 2, or a status code like 1 for success or 0 for fail. An attacker might guess that.
Okay.
They don't need to break the hard math. They don't need to factor N, which is this giant number.
They just try encrypting the likely inputs themselves.
Precisely. They just take the small numbers they suspect 0, 1, 2, 3, maybe up to 100, encrypt each one using the public key, which everyone knows.
Right.
And then they just compare their results to the target ciphertext they intercepted. If they find a match, boom. They know the original message instantly.
Wow. So the crypto is useless for small, predictable messages. That's a classic implementation break, isn't it? Not a cipher break.
Exactly. The fix isn't a stronger algorithm. It's a smarter implementation standard.
Which means using proper padding schemes.
Correct. You need things like OAEP, optimal asymmetric encryption padding, or even older standards like PKCS CAG1 version 1.5. These schemes take your small message, say M5, and they add a whole bunch of structured randomness to it before it ever hits the RSA math.
So the input to the actual RSA function is now big and unique every time.
Yep. Even if you encrypt M5 twice, you'll get 2 completely different ciphertexts because the padding introduces randomness. That completely shuts down that simple input guessing attack.
Makes total sense. Okay, another place where implementation seems fragile is randomness itself. Seems simple, but getting good random numbers is critical, right? Especially for keys and some cipher.
Oh, it's absolutely critical, and it's a catastrophic failure point if you get it wrong. Developers, maybe they're in a hurry. They might just grab whatever the OS provides. But if that OS randomness source is weak, Maybe it's based on predictable things like process IDs, or maybe network packet timings that aren't really random, or just low-quality I/O events if the seed for the random number generator is predictable.
Then the attacker can just predict the whole sequence of random numbers.
They can recreate the entire sequence. You could be using, like, military-grade AES 256, but if your 256-bit key was generated using a predictable random number generator,
Your key space isn't really 2256 anymore. It collapses down to however many predictable seeds there are.
precisely. Something easily searchable. The perfect math gets totally undermined by one lazy call to a bad pseudo-random number generator. And this need for careful state management, it extends it to complex protocols too.
You mentioned things like secure coin fighting or oblivious transfer. These are protocols where the parties don't necessarily trust each other.
Exactly. Take oblivious transfer. Alice has two messages, M0 and M1. Bob wants to get one of them, let's say M1, but Alice shouldn't find out which one he chose.
Okay.
The protocol involves some fairly complex math. A developer might just implement the steps and assume the math prevents cheating.
But what if Alice just sends garbage instead of one of the real messages? How does Bob stop her from cheating?
It's not magic. It comes down to careful implementation. Let's say Alice sends junk instead of a valid encrypted M0. When Bob gets the encrypted pair and tries to decrypt the one he chose, using his secret choice, if the input from Alice was garbage.
The decryption function itself should fail.
Yes. The decryption primitive, like AES or whatever is being used, should return an error code. It'll signal an invalid format or bad padding or just failure. Bob has to check that return value in step 6 of the protocol.
So ignoring return codes from crypto functions is a huge no-no. You're basically trusting the other party didn't cheat or mess up.
It's an implementation nightmare waiting to happen. If Bob's code just assumes success and uses the garbage output, Alice might successfully cheat, or worse, the program might crash in a way that's exploitable.
Okay. And this need for verification, you mentioned using external tools, something called pairage repeat.
Right. So imagine you're implementing something really complex, maybe your own C code for elliptic curve cryptography math. ECC is notoriously tricky to get right. How do you know your C code is correct? You can't just trust it. We strongly advise using a well-tested specialized math library like PEDRIPI as a reference.
What is pairage exactly?
It's a computer algebra system, highly optimized and debugged for number theory. You run your calculation, say, adding 2 points on your curve in your custom C code. Then you run the exact same calculation in PAIR-UP.
And if the results don't match down to the last bit?
You know your C code has a bug? It's an essential external validation step. You have to assume your implementation is broken until proven otherwise.
That connects really well to hash functions. The math behind them seems incredibly strong, designed to be one way, but implementation choices, you mentioned the birthday paradox.
Yeah, hash functions are designed to resist two main attacks. First is finding a pre-image. Given the hash output H and M, find the original input M. That's hard. It takes about 2n operations where n is the hash lengths in bits.
Okay, that's the ideal one-way property.
The second is finding a collision. Find any two different messages, M and M, such that HM equals HM. So they hash to the same value.
And that second one, finding a collision, is much easier because of this birthday thing.
Dramatically easier. The birthday paradox is weirdly counterintuitive, right? You'd think you'd need maybe 180 people in a room to get a 50-50 chance of two sharing a birthday out of 365 days.
Yeah, something like that.
But because you're comparing every pair of people, the probability grows much faster. You only need 23 people for a better than 50% chance.
Oh, wow. Okay. And that pairwise comparison logic applies to finding hash collisions.
Correctly. It cuts the effective strength against collision attacks in half in terms of bits. Instead of needing 2n work, you only need roughly 2n2 work to find a collision.
So for an older hash like SHA-1, which has a 160-bit output,
Its collision resistance isn't 160 bits, it's effectively only 80 bits. 280 is still a big number, but it's within reach of well-funded attackers, and collisions have been demonstrated.
which is why choosing the right hash function is an implementation decision with huge security consequences. You need something like SHA-256 or SHA-3.
Absolutely. With a 256-bit hash, the collision resistance is around 2128, which is considered secure for the foreseeable future. The choice of algorithm, based on understanding these implementation-related attacks, is critical.
Okay, so we've seen how even applying good math can go wrong in code. But you mentioned the real chaos, maybe where like 90% of actual exploits come from is lower down memory management.
Yeah, we're shifting gears now from, let's say, subtle mathematical misapplications to the brute force reality of hacking. The sources are really clear on this. Most successful widespread exploits target memory corruption vulnerabilities.
Buffer overflows, format string bugs, that kind of thing.
Exactly those. Buffer overflows are the classic example.
And the goal here isn't just to make the program crash, although that often happens, right? The sophisticated attacker wants more.
Oh yeah, crashing is just noise. The ultimate goal is execution control. The attacker wants to hijack the program's normal flow of instructions. They want to make the program stop running its own code and start running their code instead.
Basically reprogramming the process on the fly.
That's a great way to put it. Reprogramming the process without actually modifying the program file on disk.
That sounds incredibly difficult on a modern OS. How does an attacker even begin to grab control like that? It involves exploiting the stack.
Precisely. The stack is a region of memory used heavily in languages like C and C++ to manage function calls. When function A calls function B,
Okay.
the stack is used to store things like the local variables for function B, but critically, it also stores the return address.
The EIP, the instruction pointer.
Right. That address tells the CPU exactly where in function A's code it should jump back to once function B is finished. It's like leaving a breadcrumb trail to find your way back.
Okay, so it's essential for making function calls work in sequence.
Absolutely. Allows for deep nesting of calls. The fatal flaw happens when developers use functions that copy data without checking if there's enough space in the destination buffer.
The infamous ones like SartPy or Sprint.
Those are the poster children. Straupy, for instance, just copies bytes from a source string to a destination buffer until it hits a null byte, the end of string marker. It has no idea how big the destination buffer actually is.
So if the source string is longer than the buffer?
The extra bytes just keep writing, spilling over into whatever happens to be next on the stack. This could overwrite other local variables, maybe saved registers, and crucially, it can overwrite that stored return address, the EIP.
Wow. So the attacker provides a really long input string.
Crafted very carefully.
And they can overwrite the return address with a value they choose.
Exactly. They can make the EIP point to any memory location they want. When the vulnerable function finishes and tries to return, instead of going back to the normal code path in function A, the CPU jumps to the attacker's chosen address.
That gives them complete control over where the program executes next. Frightening.
It is. There's a classic example often used in security training. Imagine a simple game of chance program. Maybe it has different game modes, selected using a function pointer called current game. If an attacker finds a buffer overflow, maybe in the player's name input, they could overwrite that current game function pointer. Instead of pointing to play roulette, they make it point to a different function already in the program's memory, maybe one called jackpot, that instantly gives winnings.
So when the program later tries to call whatever current game points to?
It jumps straight to jackpot. The attacker didn't inject new code, they just redirected the existing flow using the overflow.
But hang on, what about modern defenses? We hear about things like DEP or NX-bit data execution prevention and ASLR address space layout randomization. Don't those stop these attacks?
That's a really important point. Yes, those mitigations make exploitation harder, significantly harder. DEP prevents attackers from simply placing their malicious code, shell code, onto the stack and jumping to it. The stack memory is marked as non-executable.
Okay, so you can't just run code from the stack anymore.
Right. And ASLR randomizes the memory addresses, where key things like libraries and the stack itself are loaded each time the program runs. This makes it much harder for the attacker to guess the correct address to jump to, or the address of useful functions like system.
So have these defenses killed buffer overflows?
They haven't killed them, but they've raised the bar. Attackers have developed more complex techniques. For DEP, they might use return-oriented programming, or ROP.
ROP?
Instead of injecting their own code, they find small snippets of existing executable code within the program's legitimate libraries called gadgets that end in a return instruction. They chain these gadgets together by carefully overwriting the stack with a series of addresses. Each gadget performs a small step, like loading a value into a register, and then the ret instruction pops the next gadget's address off the stack and jumps to it. It's like building a new program out of tiny Lego bricks of existing code.
Wow, that sounds incredibly complex.
It is. And to defeat ASLR, attackers might need to find a separate information leak vulnerability first, something that reveals a memory address, which they can then use as a reference point to calculate the location of other things they need. So the defenses help, But exploitation is still possible if the underlying memory corruption bug exists.
Okay, so assuming the attacker does manage to redirect execution, either to their own code or via ROP, they need a payload, right? This is where shell code comes in.
Exactly. Shellcode is the actual malicious instruction sequence the attacker wants to run. It's typically very small, maybe a few hundred bytes, written directly in machine code, binary bytes. It often gets smuggled into memory as part of that oversized input string used in the overflow.
Right, hiding it in the buffer itself.
Yeah. But even if they bypass ASLR somehow, getting the EIP to land precisely at the very first byte of the shellcode can still be tricky. There might be slight variations in stack layout.
So they use that trick, the NOP sled. What exactly is that?
A NOP sled. NOP stands for no operation. It's an instruction that tells the CPU to basically do nothing and just move to the next instruction.
Okay.
The attacker puts a long sequence of these NOP instructions, maybe hundreds of them, right before their actual shellcode payload in the buffer.
Ah, so it creates like a big landing pad.
Exactly, like a runway. If the overwritten EIP jumps anywhere within that long sequence of NOPs, the CPU just harmlessly slides down the sled one instruction at a time until it hits the first real instruction of the actual shellcode payload.
That makes hitting the target much easier. It trades pinpoint accuracy for a much higher probability of success.
Precisely. It makes the exploit much more reliable across different systems or minor environmental variations.
And what does this shellcode typically do once it runs? You mentioned getting a shell.
For remote exploits, the classic goal is port-binding shellcode. This tiny piece of code makes system calls low-level requests to the operating system to do a few things. First, create a network socket. Second, bind it to listen on a specific TCP port, often a non-standard one like the infamous hacker port 31337. And third, launch command prompt or shell, like binsh on Linux or cmd.exe on Windows, and connect its input and output directly to that network socket.
So the attacker can then just connect to that port from their own machine.
And they get a remote command prompt running with the privileges of the exploited program on the victim's machine. Full control. This is often achieved using very specific byte sequences that translate directly into system calls like socket, bind, listen, accept, and exebinch on Linux, for example.
It's just amazing that this entire low-level system hijack often starts with a high-level developer mistake, like not checking the length of a string being copied.
It really is. And that brings us to another key failure pattern in this area. Developers making mistakes based on insecure defaults or just making faulty assumptions about the environment their code runs in.
Assuming things are stable or configured securely when they aren't.
Exactly. Developers often code for the happy path or assume standard configurations. Take shellcode for Windows, for example. Sometimes attackers want their shellcode to drop privileges after gaining initial access, maybe using the revert to self API call.
Okay, that makes sense from a stealth perspective.
This function lives in a standard Windows library, advapi32.dlol. Now, an attacker could write shellcode that first checks if this library is loaded, and if the function pointer for revert to self is valid, not 0, before calling it.
But they often don't.
Often they skip that check. Why? Because advapi32.dl is almost always loaded in a typical Windows process. Skipping the check saves maybe 5-10 bytes in their shellcode, which is sometimes critical, but
If it happens not to be loaded in some unusual or hardened environment.
the shellcode crashes when it tries to call a null pointer. It's a small failure point, but it exists purely because of an assumption about the environment's defaults.
That's a great example. What about assumptions in, say, a forensic context, like when attackers are trying to avoid detection?
Absolutely critical there. Red teamers, penetration testers, or actual attackers constantly worry about logging. A common mistake is assuming that detailed logging isn't enabled on a target system.
Like with PowerShell.
PowerShell is a perfect example. Administrators can enable features like script block logging, which logs the exact content of every script executed, or transcription logging, which captures all input and output.
So if an attacker assumes those are off and starts running obvious malicious commands.
Their entire playbook gets logged, potentially alerting defenders immediately. A careful attacker needs to probe for these logging mechanisms first, or use techniques designed to evade them. You simply cannot assume the defaults are insecure or that logging is off. Failing to check is an implementation failure on the attacker's part, ironically. So we've covered flaws in applying the math, flaws in handling memory. This third area shifts focus again. We're moving beyond the code itself, beyond the software bugs, and into the physical environment. How does data leak out through physics, not just logic?
Right. This requires a real shift in thinking, doesn't it? Usually when I'm writing code to encrypt something, I kind of assume my own computer is trustworthy. But here, the threat model changes.
It has to. In certain high-stakes scenarios, think hardware hacking, attacking payment terminals, smart cards, or even state-level intelligence operations. You must assume the computer executing the cryptography is potentially compromised or actively hostile.
The machine itself could be leaking secrets.
Precisely. The physical hardware might be betraying the cryptographic operations running on it. And this leads us directly to side-channel attacks.
Okay, side channels. Define that for us. How does information leak unintentionally?
A side-channel attack exploits information that leaks from a system through channels other than the intended cryptographic input-output. It's not about finding a flaw in the AES algorithm's mathematics. It's about observing the physical consequences of running that AES algorithm.
And what forms does this leakage take?
The most common ones are variations in power consumption. Different operations draw slightly different amounts of power. Electromagnetic emissions running chips radiate faint EM fields that can correlate with the data being processed. And, maybe the most subtle, variations in timing.
Timing attacks, yeah, those always seem kind of mind-bending. How can tiny differences in how long an operation takes actually reveal secrets like a key?
It often comes down to how modern CPUs work, especially with caches. Accessing data from the CPU's fast L1 or L2 cache is much quicker than fetching it from slower main memory, RAM.
Okay.
Now imagine a cryptographic algorithm, maybe during a key scheduling step or inside the main encryption loop. If the specific operation being performed or the memory address being accessed depends on the value of a few bits of the secret key. And if accessing that key-dependent data results in a cache hit sometimes and a cache miss other times, then the time taken for that part of the algorithm will vary slightly depending on the secret key bits.
Wow, so the attacker doesn't need to see the data, just measure the timing very precisely.
Exactly. They run the operation many times, maybe feeding it chosen inputs, and they measure the execution time with extremely high precision. By analyzing these tiny timing variations statistically, they can start to infer information about the secret key, often bit by bit.
And this isn't just theoretical, right? This exact kind of timing side channel was behind some massive vulnerabilities recently.
Absolutely. The huge transient execution vulnerabilities like Spectre and Meltdown are prime examples of side channels weaponized at an architectural level.
How did they work, in simple terms?
They exploited features of modern CPUs designed to speed things up, like speculative execution. The CPU tries to guess what instructions will be needed next and executes them ahead of time. Meltdown, for instance, allowed a regular program running in user mode to speculatively access kernel memory it should never be allowed to read.
Even though the access would eventually be blocked.
Right, the CPU would realize its mistake and discard the result. But the act of accessing that kernel memory, even speculatively, would pull that data into the CPU cache. Then, a carefully timed side-channel attack checking access times for different memory locations could detect which kernel memory address had been brought into the cache, effectively leaking the secret data from the kernel to the user program.
That's terrifying. It used a timing side channel to bypass fundamental memory protection.
It did. And the main mitigation for Meltdown, called kernel page table isolation, or KPTI, really shows how serious these architectural side channels are.
What does KPTI do?
Well, historically, for performance reasons, the map of the kernel's memory, its page tables, was kept accessible in the address space of every running process. Even though the process couldn't directly run kernel data, KPTI changes that fundamentally. It completely separates the user process's memory map from the kernel's memory map.
So when user code is running, the kernel map just isn't there.
Pretty much. It's hidden away. This stops the speculative execution from being able to pull kernel data into the cache in a way the user process can detect via timing.
But that separation must have a cost, right?
A significant performance cost, yes. Every time the program needs to make a system call, asking the kernel to do something, the CPU has to switch between these entirely separate memory maps. That switching takes time, slowing things down noticeably for some workloads. It illustrates the high price we pay to fix these subtle physical leakage pathways.
This idea of physical leakage, it's not just about chips, is it? There's that amazing story about the Pentagon and Muzak.
Oh yeah, that's a fantastic historical anecdote, really drives the point home. During the Cold War, apparently senior officials at the Pentagon whose offices overlooked buildings across the river were given a strange instruction.
Which was?
They had to play Muzak, that generic ambient background music, whenever they were having sensitive conversations in their offices.
Play Muzak. Why? Just to relax?
Not at all. It was a countermeasure. The concern was that adversaries, maybe the Russians, could be using sophisticated listening devices from those buildings across the river.
Like microphones.
Maybe, but possibly more advanced. Techniques like aiming microwaves at the office windows. The sound waves from conversations inside the office cause tiny vibrations in the window glass. Microwaves reflecting off that vibrating glass could potentially pick up those vibrations and reconstruct the speech. The window acts like a giant, unintended microphone diaphragm.
Seriously, that's incredible. So the music wasn't for atmosphere, it was acoustic camouflage.
Exactly. It was intended to clutter the ambient sound environment, adding noise to make it much harder, hopefully impossible, for any eavesdropping device relying on vibrations or faint sounds leaking through the structure to isolate the actual conversation.
That just perfectly illustrates physical side channels beyond the computer itself. The building materials become part of the attack surface.
It really does. And it connects directly to why we need specialized hardened hardware for certain things today. Think about high-value targets that are physically accessible to attackers.
Like the smart cards used for pay TV subscriptions. Or maybe those chips in printer cartridges that try to prevent refills.
Exactly those kinds of things.
Yeah.
In pay TV, the smart card holds the secret keys needed to decrypt the satellite or cable broadcast. If an attacker can get that key out of one card,
they can clone it and get free TV or sell access.
Right, so those chips are under intense attack, not just software attacks, but physical attacks. Attackers might use microprobing needles, focused ion beams, electron microscopes, laser cutters, or precise voltage glitches to try and read the memory directly or disrupt the chip's security mechanisms.
So the specialized hardware used in those cards, it's not necessarily using stronger crypto algorithms.
Often not. It might be running standard AES or DES. The key difference is the physical hardening. The chips might have layers of protective mesh wiring that triggers an alarm if cut. Sensors to detect changes in temperature or voltage, light sensors, internal memory encryption, maybe logic designed to self-destruct if tampered with.
It's all about increasing the cost and difficulty of the physical attack.
Precisely. It raises the barrier massively. It forces the attacker away from simple software exploits and into the realm of expensive specialized laboratory equipment and deep hardware expertise. It's risk management through physical implementation.
Okay, we've gone from bad code to leaky windows. We've seen how crypto fails in practice. It's rarely the math. It's the implementation, the architecture, the physical reality. So for the developers listening, for the architects, what's the defense? How do we build systems that can actually survive this kind of scrutiny?
I think the most important thing is a fundamental mindset shift. We have to stop thinking of security as just a feature, like something you bolt on at the end of the development cycle. It needs to be a core design concern, right from the start. An architectural property the system must have. Good design practices should naturally lead you towards more secure outcomes, rather than relying on developers being constantly hyper-vigilant against every possible flaw.
And that starts at the code level, with really solid defensive coding habits like better validation.
Absolutely. Starting with what we might call robust domain validation. It's not enough just to check if an input is, say, not null or if it's an integer.
Okay.
If you have a business concept, like a quantity in an online store, your code needs to enforce the actual business rules that define what a valid quantity is. Maybe it has to be an integer between 1 and 500. Just checking it's not null isn't enough. You need to validate it against its allowed domain.
Because failing to do that leads to weird, unexpected states that attackers might exploit.
Exactly. And moving beyond just inputs, managing the state of the application, especially when you have multiple things happening at once, concurrency, that's another huge source of bugs and vulnerabilities.
Race conditions and things like that.
Yeah, race conditions are a classic example. A huge step towards better security, and often simpler code, is to aggressively reduce the complexity of how you manage state. One powerful way is to separate operations that change data, commands or writes, from operations that just read data, queries.
Okay, the CQRS pattern, command query responsibility segregation.
That's one way, yes. And related to that is embracing immutable data structures whenever possible.
Immutable meaning, once you create the data object, it can never be changed.
Correct. Think of an entity snapshot. You load the customer data, create an immutable snapshot object. If you need to change the customer, you create a new snapshot object reflecting the change. You don't modify the old one.
How does that help security?
It completely eliminates entire classes of bugs, especially race conditions. If the data object itself cannot be changed after creation, you don't have to worry about two different threads trying to modify it simultaneously and ending up with corrupted or inconsistent state.
So you avoid all that complex, error-prone locking code, the synchronized blocks that can cause deadlocks.
You often can, yes. You push the responsibility for managing concurrent state changes down to where it belongs, usually the database, which is designed for it. Using immutable objects makes your code easier to reason about, easier to test, and inherently safer in concurrent environments. It's a defensive design principle.
Okay, so good code hygiene is key. But we also need to actively look for flaws. How do we bring in that adversarial perspective during development?
We have to test like an attacker would. The value of adversarial testing, you just can't overstate it. We see this at the highest levels, right? Think about the NSA's Red Team.
Right, their job is basically to break stuff the government wants to buy.
Pretty much. Before the government deploys new hardware or software, the Red Team gets unleashed on it to find vulnerabilities, to make sure it meets a really high security standard. You have to assume that skilled, motivated attackers will scrutinize your product eventually.
And for companies, maybe that translates to things like bug bounty programs, vulnerability reward programs.
Absolutely. VRPs, or bug bounties, are a fantastic way to leverage the global security research community. You're inviting external, independent eyes to find flaws you might have missed.
It widens the net of testers massively.
It does, and it's a great investment, even if the initial rewards seem small. I think Google's very first VRP literally offered just a t-shirt for finding a bug. The value comes from the sheer breadth and diversity of testing you get.
But you can't rely solely on manual testing, especially for big, complex applications. How does automation fit into security testing? We need this in our CI/CD pipelines, right?
Definitely. Automation is crucial, and a key technique here is fuzzing.
Fuzzing, what is that exactly?
Fuzzing, or fuzz testing, is basically automated negative testing on steroids. You take your application's inputs, API parameters, file formats, network protocols, and you automatically generate huge numbers of slightly mutated, malformed, or unexpected variations of those inputs.
You like throwing garbage at the application to see if it breaks.
Kind of, but often more intelligently. The fuzzer might use known attack patterns, boundary values, weird character sets, really long strings, etc. It bombards the application with these inputs.
And then watches for crashes, errors.
Exactly. It monitors the application for any signs of distress. Crashes, assertion failures, unexpected error messages, weird delays, maybe changes in state that shouldn't have happened. Fuzzing is incredibly effective at finding those obscure edge case bugs, especially memory corruption flaws that manual testing would almost certainly miss.
So it saves a ton of time and effort compared to trying to think of every possible bad input yourself.
Immense time and mental fatigue. Integrating fuzzing into your regular build and test pipeline is a really powerful way to continuously find and fix security vulnerabilities early.
Okay, so defensive coding, adversarial testing, automation. Before we even start implementing these controls, though, is there a crucial first step to avoid just boiling the ocean?
Yes, absolutely. Before you spend a dime or write a line of code on a security control, you need to do an adequate risk assessment.
Figure out what you're actually protecting against and how likely it is.
Precisely. You need to understand the actual business risk. What's the potential impact if this vulnerability is exploited? How likely is it to be exploited? And what's the cost in time, money, complexity of implementing the proposed defense?
So you weigh the cost of the fix against the cost of the potential breach.
Right. Think about the commuter train platform example. Is there a risk someone could fall onto the tracks? Yes. Do we need to install floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass barriers along the entire platform? Probably not. The cost is immense, and the risk, while real, is managed adequately by simpler controls.
Like the yellow warning line and maybe some announcements?
Exactly. A simple yellow line and telling people to be careful is usually considered an adequate control for that specific risk. The goal of risk assessment isn't to eliminate all risk or to justify implementing every security control imaginable. It's to determine the appropriate level of control for the specific risks you face, making sure you focus your resources on the most critical threats, like preventing those memory corruption issues, or ensuring proper key management, rather than over-engineering defenses for minor issues.
It's about smart allocation of effort, avoiding security theater.
Perfectly put. Avoiding overreaction and maximizing your defensive posture where it truly matters.
Well, we started this deep dive thinking about pure math, but we quickly found that the real story of crypto failure is almost never the math itself. It's the architecture, it's the implementation details, it's everything from, tiny timing differences in a CPU cache to forgetting to check string lengths, even down to the physical environment.
And I think that journey highlights something really profound, maybe a cognitive challenge for anyone building complex systems.
Hmm.
It's always, always easier to break something than it is to build it securely.
Mm.
And when you're in the thick of it, under pressure, maybe facing deadlines, it's incredibly hard to recognize you're walking through a cognitive minefield, even if, the voice of reason is available somewhere.
Right.
So the key to real defensive coding, to building resilient systems, maybe isn't about being the smartest or fastest coder. Maybe it's more about humility. It's about adopting practices, checklists, using trusted libraries, following secure design patterns that deliberately force you to slow down.
Force you to question assumptions.
Exactly. Question your assumptions, verify your inputs, verify your outputs, handle your errors, designing code with the explicit assumption that someone will scrutinize your work, someone will attack it. You have to anticipate the chaos.
Assume the scrutiny, embrace the checklist, handle the chaos. A powerful closing thought. So, for everyone listening, based on this, what specific implementation detail, what assumption in your own code are you going back to check right now? We'll leave you with that.